Yeah.
Hi everyone, it's coming up to 1 o'clock and inevitably with meetings like this people will join us a few minutes late because they're coming back from things. But if you wait until the last person joins us, it'll probably be 2 o'clock and that won't be a good use of time. So welcome, particularly welcome to Claire and Elena, and welcome to the first of our webinar series this academic year actually, so happy new academic year. Interestingly, and we kind of didn't really envisage this, this is incredibly timely for all sorts of reasons. Not least, last week we had the government response to the Stage 2, Phase 2 technical consultation, which actually talked up, emphasised the value of student engagement as a measure of good teaching practice. Now, we'll have to, the devil will be in the detail, but nevertheless, this engagement of students is clearly a key aspect of the agenda going forward, and it's really brilliant that Elena is going to talk to us about the work that's going on at John Moores, been going on at John Moores, in terms of using data well to support student development, I guess, is what I'm hoping we're going to be talking about. If we're going to be talking about something different, that'll be fine too, but I'm really looking forward to that as a topic. Okay, and as predicted, just as I start to speak, lots of other people arrive and miss the first bit, but they can get a recording. 3 things to say, and then I will shut up and disappear from your screens. We'll record the session, so if you want to come back to it, we will provide a link and you can listen again, watch again, enjoy again, hopefully, participate again, almost. That's one point. Second point is, if you have on your screen on the right-hand side, you'll find you can access a whole range of things. We will mute microphones when Claire and Elena are speaking to cut out background noise, particularly for people who are in open plan space. Microphones are brilliant at picking up the person eating their lunch 3 tables from the left, and not always brilliant at doing other things. So we'll mute the microphones, but you will have the chance later on to join the discussion in real time, and you have the chance throughout to put questions or issues or thoughts into the chat box, and you can access the chat box through the little opportunity on the right-hand side of your screen, and add your comments, thoughts, perceptions. Claire, if you want to pick any of those up as we go along, that's absolutely fine. But I will do a bit of checking as we go, and if certain things come up and we don't get a chance to talk about them, I'll perhaps group them and feed them in towards the end. So if that's okay, we'll do a kind of treble act, if you like. If they're all dealt with as we go along, that's fine. If not, then we'll pick them up before we finish.
Okay.
Is that okay? Brilliant. Okay, hope that's okay with everyone. That was mercifully short, wasn't it? I'm going to get out of the way. I'll turn off my webcam, I'll turn off my microphone, and colleagues, over to you. Expenditure.
Okay, hello. My name is Claire Milsom, and I work at the Teaching and Learning Academy in Liverpool John Moores University with my colleague
Elena Zaitsewa. I work with Claire.
Okay, so what we're going to describe to you is some research that we have done with institutional data using the UKES survey tool.
I'm about to
okay, so we're just right. So just as the reason we picked on UKES is that we have the Teaching and Learning Academy runs all our surveys, so we manage the NSS, the module evaluation, PTES. So we're always looking, particularly in the comments, at changes in sort of student behaviour and performance. And what we see across the sector, and also what we've seen in our surveys, is that the way that students are engaging in higher education, and the sector is moving from that kind of satisfaction survey to one which measures students' engagement in their learning experience. And so this quote here exemplifies that. Enhancing student engagement has moved from a cottage industry stage to becoming a high-stakes, sector-wide imperative. And as Rob said at the start, never has this been more true. We see in the UK's, the NSS surveys mentioned, sorry, in the TEF, the NSS surveys mentioned, but also we see the only other survey tool explicitly mentioned is UK's and its role in learning gain. So it's becoming increasingly more prominent in higher education policy, the use of these data to evidence learning gain and to evidence students' engagement in their learning experience. Have the next slide, Catherine. Okay, so how we got here. The HEA advertised for institutions to pilot the survey, and our first engagement with the pilot was in 2014. We just included the mandatory scales around higher order learning, course challenge, collaborative learning and academic integration. And from the optional scales, we selected time spent. We didn't send it out institutionally. We, through our kind of Associate Dean's Education, we identified 3 faculties. And then within the faculties, we showed the surveys to programs and asked them to volunteer to be part of the pilot. And we had 24 programs in total. But they don't represent a cross-disciplinary section because we missed out technology and engineering, but they do look at a whole range of approaches, STEM programs and more social science programs. Given that these were programs that had elected to be part of a pilot, the response rate was a little bit disappointing because these were sort of purposely sample programs, and yet the response rate was only 15%. But I would say that the response rate is something that the sector struggles with, not just in our institution. And that even given the response rate, in large programs this was representative. So we analysed the UK's outcomes as we would do for all our surveys, for the NSS and the modular evaluation, as I've mentioned, and PTES. And what we found was a very different set of insights to what we would see in the more satisfaction-directed surveys and our own modular evaluation. And the strong areas for us as an institution was that our approach to feedback and the usefulness of that, and that is mirrored in our outcomes for the NSS, the scales and items around feedback. We tend to score more highly in comparison to sector benchmarks. Interactions with staff was also strong, and we see in the narrative and the positive comments in the NSF and in PTES how much students value working with academic staff and the sort of partnership they have in that situation, and also our careers advice. So these came out strong areas, and they were areas that we could recognise and that we had seen in other surveys. But areas where we as an institution were challenged are then listed below that bullet point. And these were, I think the reason we have worked so much with UKs is these were insights that we couldn't get in other surveys, that we couldn't get from our own modular evaluation, and we don't get from NSS, although the NSS is changing to include scales on challenge and collaboration. So the NSS will actually align more directly. But firstly, the first thing we saw 2 years ago was the extent that the course had challenged students to do their best work. As a sector, we didn't perform below the sector, but more importantly, the variation across programs was enormous. So we saw a huge variation in scores across the programs that were part of the pilot, and also we saw a high percentage of students that didn't actually respond to that question, so weren't even able to respond or didn't recognise how they would respond to that question. So that was an area for us. And we'd also seen in PTES, for our postgraduate talks survey, some issues around course challenge. So that was one insight that UK's provided for us. Second UK's insight was around collaborative learning, and I've said this is more learning with each other. And the questions that they ask in this scale are around a student helping you to understand course material. And what we saw there is that whilst in other institutions like ours, the post-1992 benchmarking institutions, there was a positive contribution towards collaborative learning, the LGMU scores were relatively low. So as an institution, working with your peers in this way to help to improve your learning experience, to improve your own understanding, was lower than in institutions like ours in post-1992 institutions, and that wasn't anything we'd seen before institutionally. And this was also true of academic integration. Again, there was a huge variation across the programs and demographics, but asking questions in class was very low in terms of often and very often LGMU, which was 49%, compared to post-1992 average, which was 61%. And then our optional scale, time spent, and given that we're kind of a very urban institution without a campus environment particularly, what we saw was the participation of students in extracurricular activities or co-curricular activities extremely low. 60% of our students responding that they don't take part in these activities, with the sector at 37%. So this was a real difference, and something we've been talking about with our Students' Union. So what we felt, if the UKES is quite a complex questionnaire, but we felt that it provided insights that we weren't seeing from other surveys, and we felt that there was a reason to continue this survey. And so in 2015 we invited all non-final year students to respond. So not the students taking the NSS, but anyone who didn't take the NSS, we invited to respond. And we got a response rate of 17%, which we thought was disappointing, but actually as a sector that really is quite positive. Sorry. Okay. So in terms of, I'm just going to briefly go through the findings of the institutional data. Could you just press it again? Okay, and the other one as well, that would be great. So both diagrams are up, okay? So these slides just reinforce this diversity issue. So if we take that question about asking questions in class, when we started to compare outcomes across faculties, we saw that a huge diversity to sort of bimodal, really, actually, I suppose is what I'm saying. So that in our science, in our STEM groups, almost half what they were doing in social studies and education faculty. So a very different outcome. And then we looked at demographically as well. And our non-European students, what we saw for our non-European students was, was that the way that they worked with each other was much lower than for other institutions, similar institutions to ours. So the way they were working with each other and learning from each other was much lower than in other institutions. Yeah, the next slide, Catherine. Okay, so if we put the graph up as well, sorry, if you return again. Okay, and then the other thing, staff-student partnership, again, just to show the variation. So the colours represent different faculties, but even within the faculty, even with similar disciplines, you could see, for example, that computing was half what we saw in nursing, and law half what we saw in the School of Arts. Yeah. So even within similar sort of cognate areas, we saw this huge difference in outcome. Okay.
Claire, did you just get the message from Nikki? Sorry, it's Rob. About explaining the acronyms.
Okay, sorry. So, what did I say? So, FET. Did I say? So, just to say, the three colours represent different faculties.
Four colours.
The four colours are different faculties, and the yellow represents technology and engineering, environment. The blue. The blue represents education and health. The green is arts, professionals and social studies, and red is science. So they're different cognate groups. But in spite that aside, it's just how the variation of outcomes.
percentage of often and very often. So it's a kind of score scale. It's all three questions combined.
Yeah. Okay. The next one. So in terms of, so then we applied for one of the Higher Education Academy Strategic Initiative grants, and we were successful in that application. And we used our experience on the pilot to form this research project. And what we found were the main challenges was the student engagement outcomes are quite complex, and if we want staff to use them for programme enhancement, we wanted to make good at the HEED project. It was like the effective engagement with engagement data, because the outcomes themselves are a little off-putting for busy academics who want to make improvements. It's not as simple as a satisfaction outcome. So that was one area we worked in, to look making these data more accessible for academic staff. And aligned with that was, how do we make managers take this more seriously? They're far more focused on satisfaction, maybe not so much since the sort of TEF outcomes, but there's much more about satisfaction. It's a much more measurable metric, more comparative, longitudinal metric. So we needed to convince managers to take these seriously. And to do that, we wanted to embed these outcomes in our institutional quality enhancement processes. We felt that that was the main sort of thrust of our Higher Education Academy project. The next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, and so what we entertained was into looking at was the relationship with our UCAS outcomes, to see how they correlated with other student outcomes, performance, retention and satisfaction. So we looked at what they scored in programs, good honours, honours, the proportion that were retained, and how happy, how satisfied they were with their programs. And then we also looked at relationships within the survey itself. So within the UCAS survey, we looked at the relationships between particular scales, particular categories and particular questions or items, and we used a condition independence analysis. And then we did some qualitative work with particular programs to look at what they meant, what they understood the outcomes to mean, and then we looked specifically at how the utility of these data for curriculum enhancement, and if we were going to use them for curriculum enhancement, how we embed that into our quality assurance mechanism.
Yeah, next slide.
Next slide, sorry.
Yeah, it's me now. So I'll talk really briefly about our research findings. It was a year-long project, and I think we found a lot of interesting things. Probably won't have enough time to talk about everything. So apologies for the small font, but this is just to give you an indication how the whole research project was organized, so what we've done. First of all, it was institutional data analysis, very thorough. We've done data breakdown by faculty, by school, but we also produced over 100 individual program level reports where we broke data down by level of study and other demographic variables to show program leaders the value of the data, so they could have a look at engagement of level 4 students, level 5 students, compare some of the variables. So this was the first stage. And at the same time, we were looking at the trends. We're looking at specific subject areas, at differences in scores. This was happening pretty much at the same time. And this data helped us to identify case studies. We picked up 3 case studies, 3 programs from different disciplinary areas. And program teams were quite keen to take part in our research and to contribute with their thoughts and reflections on the UCAS data. And then the actual quantitative institutional level analysis Claire mentioned before, where we triangulated the UCAS data with students' satisfaction, performance and retention. Next slide, please, Kat. Thank you. 137 programs took part in our 2015 UCAS, and we had a subsample of 23 programs in this research, and these were programs with either high response rates, relatively high response rate, or decent cohort size, where we could really get a representative picture. As you see, those in greens, they are case studies. We looked at law, we looked at geography and math more in depth. We had focus groups with both staff and students discussing the UCAS outcomes. And other programs were also part of the research project. Sports science, for example, although response rate was just 10%, but because of the cohort, over 200 students, so we had some representative numbers there. Next slide, please, Ken. Thank you. This is just an indication of our data triangulation of our quantitative institutional research. What we found, for example, that withdrawal rates on program level had a strong negative correlation with program engagement, overall program engagement score. So the higher program engagement score was the lower was withdrawal rates. We looked at cohort size, and what we found that interaction with staff, staff-students partnership, and study time had a moderate negative correlation with cohort size. Not a rocket science. As a smaller cohort, the more students have a chance to interact with staff, have all sorts of initiatives, and more time they could spend with staff, kind of talking and discussing their studies and out of the curriculum activities. Good honors. Strong positive correlation with high order skills, with the whole scale. This was quite encouraging finding, because this was something we could really bring to staff and show them, look, there is a strong influence of this scale on students' outcomes. And assess satisfaction. Interestingly, the correlation wasn't significant. Weak, positive, but not significant. Probably because we were trying to correlate final year student satisfaction with first and second years overall engagement scores for the same program. So we'll probably need to look at final level as well in relation to UCAS. We also looked at individual students' performance. We took level mean marks, and we've done correlation and multiple regression as well. So basically using level mean mark and individual students' engagement score, which we calculated. What we found, that course challenge, taking responsibility for your own learning, strongly correlated with academic performance, strong and significant correlation. Again, something that you could probably expect to find. And again, course challenge was the strongest contributor to individual students' performance results. And the second strong was interacting with staff. Next slide, please, Kat. This is just really quick slide on a separate piece of research we've done. We actually had a student intern looking at relationships between UCAS scales using our institutional data. There will be a reference in the end of the presentation where, to the report, so you could go online and have a read about it. But what we found is just really to highlight that this orange, top orange block is course challenge, and you can see that it's linked to the top red, to the orange, yellow, I mean, I think it's orange, Claire, orange, yes, and these are critical thinking skills. So the high critical thinking skill, the more students perceive course as being challenging. And at the same time, learning with others, I think it's blue one probably, yeah, had a strong correlation with interaction with staff. It's quite interesting finding between because it looked like when program teams are really open and communicate with students kind of in an open and effective way. It does encourage students to work collaboratively with other students because there was a kind of mutual relationship. But more findings will be in the report that will be in the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. So we've got about 6 minutes. Yeah, just a few insights from qualitative research. 3 case studies. Law had very strong scores for critical thinking, reflecting and connecting, and much weaker scores for collaborative learning and interaction with staff. Geography, very strong again on critical thinking, collaborative learning, staff-students partnership, classroom activity scores were really, really low. Maths, very similar picture, interaction with staff, and weaker collaborative learning. Next, please. Just to give you some interesting insights from our focus groups. So how we did it, first of all. So we basically took the results of the UCAS for the program and went through all the results, and we're getting staff perspective on to what extent, for example, these scores were indicative of their own experience. Did they find anything surprising? Where they agree with the results that came out from the survey. And when we looked at collaborative scores, staff thought that the result of low collaborative scores were probably related to their curriculum structure. One member of staff said that structure of academic framework in our year 2 and 3 doesn't really give space for a number of these group things on. But when we did talk to students, what we found that it was collusion policy, institutional collusion policy that actually prevented, or how the policy was interpreted by students, by staff, that prevented students to collaborate actively. And this is a nice quote of one of the law students saying how they basically work in the library. They never take the same book together, they don't discuss much because they will be accused of the collusion. And apparent that probably this policy was largely maybe over-interpreted in this particular program, maybe because it's a law program and they were quite strict about it. But students were really concerned and not willing to interact, to share. Next slide, please. In geography, there was a really interesting conversation about group dynamics, and staff were saying that you can have different cohorts of students, and if there will be few mature, really proactive students in the cohort, it would change the whole dynamics, and students would interact more actively, and it will become like a norm. And in this particular year, in 2015, they didn't have any of these proactive students, and this was reflected actually in our conversation with students. They said that, as you can see from the quote, that someone has to be brave to start off, and often this cohort was quite quiet, and they're just waiting for somebody to start interacting. So this was very cohort dependent in case of geography. Next slide, please. Yeah, and in terms of math, there was a very interesting discussion about size of the cohort. Large being unmanageable and smaller one being much more kind of close-knit, friendly group, open door policy, and this is what our math program was very proud of. There were very interesting conversations about relevance of the questions, UCAS questions to the math, for example, context. They said, examining the strengths and weaknesses of your own views on a topic or issue, that question is being designed by someone who has social sciences in mind, and they have picked up on quite a few questions that they believed were not relevant or not as relevant to them, to their discipline as to others. The next one, please. Next one, yeah, thank you. Again, so very quickly, staff was questioning what is meant by best work, for example. Is it best mark students had in mind, or enjoyment, or effort, or challenge? They were questioning how students answered time spent, how they answered these questions. And students were also not entirely sure about how to answer some of the questions. They said that some said the taught sessions, such sessions they've attended, others answered it as sessions they've got in the actual timetabling. So there was quite a disparity even within one program. Yes, next please. So I'm just conscious of the time. What we found generally from the project that we undertook in relation to the UCAS data is there are strong links between UCAS data, engagement data, and other indicators of student experience and success. And this was really important because this is our weapon in a sense, so that we could discuss it with staff, we could present this evidence, and this evidence is really helpful. The conversations we had with programs were very interesting, very sensitive in a sense. It was really difficult to write up case studies for the Higher Education Academy because the level of discussion the data set generated was very deep, and they discussed very kind of sensitive questions, very personal questions in relation to how their program to work, what is the dynamics, what is the philosophy behind everything. So it was obvious that this data generates completely different level of discussion in relation to enhancement. And generally positive thing that both staff and students saw actually potential of the UCAS to influence good practice. But as Claire and I mentioned, there was a data complexity in relation to the UCAS as well. So students wanted some further clarifications, academic questions, relevance of some of the questions. Interestingly, comments were quite limited. So we found it surprising that students always are very active to comment in the NSS and P-test about their satisfaction, but they're less keen to reflect on their engagement. And this is why the further dialogue with students is needed. So you really need to get this scores, and if you're not getting enough contextual information, you need to talk to students and unpick the meanings of the scores. And timing of the survey might influence results. Or geography program were quite clear that after field work the results would have been completely different. The next slide, please. Yeah, Claire, do you want to? Yeah, just
so just say there are some general challenges. And one, the reliability of the survey, and we had this conversation with our maths team, was that the low response rate and how given that low response rate, how informative actually are against national benchmarks, and what are the response rates of those institutions contributing to the benchmark. We need to find a very firm place in the QA, QE processes, but the timing of the releasing of the results is out of sync in our own kind of institutional cycle, so how we use those. But if they're going to be used as a proxy for learning gain in the test, then we feel like as a sector we will start to see changes in the instrument itself and the timing of the instrument. Okay, the next slide, just have the final slide. And then finally, this is how we're using them. So we run staff-student forums. We've decided that really to ask people to make action plans and report on these data, it doesn't make sense. They're not linear enough. They're far more, there aren't enough comments to illuminate them. So they should prompt dialogue within a kind of an environment where there is already discussion, and they should sort of advise and prompt that situation. So we're going to use them in our staff-student forums. The outcomes will go on to WebHub, our business intelligence, the scores in future. We want them to be present more in boards of studies and work at the faculty level within student experience plans. And the reason we will get change within our institution is this is very strongly led by our Pro Vice Chancellor Education, and I think that is it's going to be some sort of cultural change in the way that we look at these outcomes, and being led right from the top, which is the way that the HEA directed these bids, has been extremely useful, because we can see how strategically we can use these outcomes, and we can modify our quality assurance processes to ensure that we listen to these data and respond to them. Thank you. I think that's good.
Yeah, so there will be next slide. So if you please move. Yeah, so we are writing up all the results. There will be much more detail for the students' engagement in higher education journal, which is a new one, and the journal is supporting work of researching, advancing, and inspiring students' engagement network that maybe some of you are aware of, and hopefully, so after the new year, we will. We'll be able to see it. And the references, could you please show the next slide, Catherine? Yeah, so references, you could go and look online at this graphical analysis of the UK survey data in Cashman report, and also we had another students researcher who specifically looked at collusion and collaboration as a UCAS narrative, and there was a report also linked to the report. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So shall we have a look?
Very much. Thanks very much, colleagues. What I think we'll do now, Kath, is to unmute microphones. Colleagues, can I ask you, if we're doing that, to be sensitive to that comes through your microphone if you're connected up. So if people want to add questions or thoughts or comments, either by speaking directly or by putting things in the chat box, now's the opportunity for that. There was a question from Philippe, who's I think had to leave, but about language data. I'm not too sure how we interpret that.
Yeah. Is it about institutional data or case study data?
Not sure. It was some time ago in the conversation. I think it was related to institutional data, but we can't ask the questioner.
Yeah, we did have data. I mean, the kind of usual breakdown, international home students. In terms, yeah, we didn't have. Unfortunately, we didn't have case study with a language program, which might have been interesting. Reason I was asking, believe language learners will be affected by level of engagement. Yeah. No, we didn't have.
But I think that point's well made. What we found with these data is that they need to be compared. They can be the outcomes are to some extent determined by the subject, much more so than the sort of satisfaction outcomes, because the questions they're asking are a lot about how programs are traditionally taught, the way they work together. So that we don't have languages at Liverpool or Moores, but I think that is a very valid. Or if they would have language would, like we saw in the faculty, that language would have very different scores because they're languages, because of the nature of the subject, in comparison with other disciplines.
Yeah, and a comment from Salo there about in collaboration, and I was just thinking something similar. That in the world outside higher education, team working and you know, the notion of people things is celebrated and required, and we're still working on a model where in some contexts at least there's a tension between giving people credit for their work and getting hooked on the notion of there's some sort of collusive process going on. Collusion in business is probably celebrated, actually, but collusion in academic context, in some academic contexts, is a challenge.
We also see a similar in the free text comments around group work. We also see a similar sort of pattern.
Yes, exactly. I'm getting a bit of feedback to say you're getting every third word from me. I'm sorry about that. Some breakup on the sound.
Yeah, a bit.
My apologies. Other comments that people want to raise about either the data, which is interestingly different according to program area from what you said in a way that student satisfaction data is not?
Well, I mean, I think there are differences in student satisfaction data, but it's far more diverse than the engagement data. It's far more influenced by the way the subject is taught.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, by pedagogic practice, really.
And you could have a very high overall satisfaction in the NSS for the program, and very specific areas that have low UCAS scores.
Yeah.
And this is quite interesting. So this is something we probably need to explore to convince staff that if their NSS scores are high, they will need to look at actually.
I think the NSS changing and the challenge of the NSS and the collaboration in the NSS will make people perhaps look at using UCAS in first and second year in a way that they haven't in the past. I think, or we would certainly, I suppose, we would certainly encourage institutions if they want to understand more about how the new NSS will work is to use some of those UCAS scales.
Yes, the new NSS, as I understand it, has 27 questions rather than 23, and some revision to questions which are much more around engagement.
There are two scales, one on challenge and one on collaboration, and one on and partnership. So it's intentionally bringing these engagement questions into the satisfaction questionnaire.
Excellent. Yeah, people just checking, Nikki just checking that there'll be a recording of this, and we'll send a link around to colleagues so you can listen again, like iPlayer. Okay, question from Jane, one also from Nikki. Have you got those, Claire and Eleanor? Can you see those?
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to just pick those two up then?
Yes, students' voice system and feedback. Yes, this is what Claire mentioned in relation to staff students forums. So this is a relatively new thing. So we are doing, we piloted it last year in one faculty, and we are rolling it over to the whole institution this year. And this is where actually UCAS data we're hoping will be looked at and discussed at staff students forums. And this is program level forums.
Yeah, this is program level, and I think that's important. The data need to be discussed kind of within the program. As Elena said, you don't get as many comments, and you can't quite understand how the students have interpreted the outcomes. So there is an aspect of dialogue with these surveys, but that really does lead to program teams being able to understand the cohort and the sort of enhancement and make enhancement to their programs. So they're really the data are really useful to inform program level enhancement, but it does require that partnership.
And that's about a kind of catalytic function.
Yeah, I think that's, and in terms of the huge variation that occurs in the program with very small numbers, well, I just have to approach that with caution, and that's why these are data to be discussed, not to be
taken as kind of final truth.
They're not. Yeah. These are not data that we would put into some engagement league table or stack up or aggregate together. They're much more complex and more subtle than that. So I think in answer to Nikki, with caution, but also working with academics, we run all our surveys from the Teaching and Learning Academy. So we're all people who are used to sort of working with data, and I think that's really important. It's not a quality assurance. We're not working necessarily in quality assurance. We are genuinely looking at program enhancement. So it is looking at those data in context and working with academics to understand the outcomes. The questions themselves are questions that program teams should be asking. They sort of identify, and I'm inverted commas, what's good about teaching and learning. So they're good questions to discuss in the context of program enhancement.
In relation to response rate, we decided not to release data with less than 5 students responded. Otherwise, it would have been meaningless. Sorry. Yeah, and 5 responses. Yeah, if you've got kind of medium-sized cohort, these 5 responses could still give you some indication of how students feel about the kind of whole engagement process. But yes, I guess Nikki is right. So we need reliable samples. We need, and this is again something that staff were querying. So I've got like 10 responses out of 100. So to what extent I have to trust this data? But the same applies to the national data. When you see the margins in Higher Education Academy national report between like top bottom institutional group. So the margins are really tiny because the national response rate is small. So it, I guess we're all interested in raising and boosting response rates nationally as well as institutionally.
And we will only really raise response rates in our institution if the academics want the outcomes, if they're encouraging the students to fill in the questionnaires. So we're spending a lot of time working with the academics so that they can get the meaning from the scores more, because it's not a flat satisfaction survey as you see with the NSS. It's not as easy to, you know, write action plans in the same way that you do with the NSS. It's far more formative.
Yes, exactly. In fact, formative was the word that came to me. Any final questions, colleagues? I just have a couple of things to say before we wrap up. Okay, I will take silence as assent. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful from Nikki, who's kind of on the same wavelength as you, I think, about encouraging participation. And yes, I mean, if it's a genuine partnership and the academics are interested in the data,
yeah,
then one hopes they will encourage students to participate in that process.
And there has to be value for academics, for people working to enhance programme in the outcomes. And I think that's what we're trying to work with.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Nikki. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Eleanor. Just a reminder that there will be a recording. There's been a recording made, and we'll make that available within the next 24 hours to everybody who was on the webinar. Thanks for making our first webinar a really interesting one. If learning gain is of interest to you, our fourth webinar, which is not yet on the website, will be learning gain through work placements. And that's a piece of work that's been led by colleagues at the University of Dundee. So watch out for that. And similarly, if excellence is on your radar, and nothing is complete without the use of the word excellence in every sentence now, alongside gold, silver and bronze, then we're having the National Tutoring Seminar in the Northwest at the University of Central Lancashire on the 26th of October, which will be looking at excellence in the context of tutorial support. And in that notion of staff-student engagement, tutoring is the really sharp end of that, I think. So thank you very much, colleagues, from what looks like quite sunny Liverpool.
I know, yeah.
Worrying, isn't it? And good afternoon, everyone, from an equally sunny Wigan, though you wouldn't know it from the room I'm in. Thanks, folks.